and I used those to examine landscape architecture, at least my understanding of it, and began with, in our country, one of the two great sins, original sins of our country, one being the theft of indigenous land, upon which our colonial country was built, but the second great sin, African enslavement, and tried to paint a picture that was kind of put it in that context, but really ask the question why we don't talk about landscape architecture, at least in the American context, with those foundations. We often begin with, I would say, the aesthetics and the tastes and the cultural sort of traditions of the wealthy, particularly from Europe, or very wealthy people in the United States, and what their preferences are, when in fact the original wealth of our country was tied to the landscape. And so the idea of revisiting how we tell our own story became a really important part of the article. And then the thing. And so, in a contemporary context, if you start to look at, particularly community work, and I'm not going to restrict it to people of color, like all community work. Those are questions that we ask now, is that, how is what we're doing as landscape architects enabling people to be better organized, to be more politically engaged, to have more economic prosperity from our work. So, it's great that we deal with stormwater. It's great that we deal with all these other issues, but there are people asking different kinds of questions for community work. Well, these are people who were thinking about that, over 150 years ago. And in some cases, the artifacts that were left behind don't match up to the criteria we use to evaluate, great landscapes. And so Jen knows this one, University of Michigan, a beautiful campus, and well regarded and championed as an example of, great campus design. But, we often don't talk about places like Tuskegee or Howard University or other places that were in some ways about negotiating the really radical political act of building intellectual capital for Black people, in the context of a country where, everything was sort of pushing against that. And so, in terms of dignity, there are actual places that, you can see and trace, through Reconstruction and even through Jim Crow, where people found places where they could come together, they could build knowledge, they could invest in one another, they could, pass that on to the next generations. And so, that was really important. And so in the journey between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia, the African-American community, Chavis Park, and in those particular areas in Raleigh was seen as a safe place halfway in between. So it has this really amazing history of people who were moving through that region, seeing it as safe harbor. So, great jazz musicians, political leaders, educators, just generations of people who did that. History that wasn't visible, right? And wasn't really talked about other than being in the heads of the residents there, right? And for the city and for other people, they just saw it as sort of a neighborhood park and relegated it to that. And so it went to disrepair. But it's going through a major renovation now, which is really putting that history front and center. And it's also resulted in some policy shifts in the city and how they affect all parks. And so, when we get to the end of the conversation, we can talk about how, the article and this conversation is focused on Black folks, but the goal is that that's a point of information for innovation, that it's not just restricted for application to and with Black folks, but is a way to improve how we do everything with everybody. And so, Chavis Park, that process of transformation is an example of that, of being very specific about the needs and the stories of Black people, provided benefit and value to now how they're thinking about all parks and all resources and all folks. So in this current generation, if you're making decisions, debt is like near the top of the list, right? And in terms of earning potential and the ability to get through. And so, we haven't responded in some ways to those contemporary economic kind of challenges, but also with family and community, that if there are some differences, in some communities, you can talk to an individual and that individual will get motivated enough and they'll go to their parents and they'll be like, yo, I want to be X, Y, and Z. Parents like, great, as long as you're happy, go for it. But in my experience, and even with my family, I'll speak to it, it's a family decision to decide what that next generation is going to do. And we don't often talk about that as we're talking about attracting young people to the profession. How do we help families understand, communities understand the value of it? And part of that, I think, is tied to some of the article, which is the story that we tell about it. If we're going in and saying, yo, they're going to be doing parking lots of Burger King, they're going to be doing people's backyards, and they're going to be doing golf courses. I mean, that's not what a lot of families want to hear, especially if they have a cultural or a social imperative. Um, so in some ways, it's a matter of what message, when, and who, right? So in terms of that theory of change, that bundle of things, it's like we reach out to the next generation and start to build this pipeline, right? I believe that we all as groups and organizations have some work to do before we're ready to really engage in it. It's not one of those things where you can say something and you take it and then you run with it and apply it, right? It's not like calculating stormwater runoff or, measuring square footage of X, Y, and Z, right? So I think a step that we skip is the internal work and the organizational work. And in reality, most of the spaces where landscape architecture operates, there aren't going to be a lot of Black and brown people in those rooms. And but that doesn't mean that work can't be done. And so some of it is assessing, I think, how we operate as institutions. So, if you're a part of an organization that has an organizational structure and leadership, is probably need to have those conversations before deploying any kind of programs. Is reflecting on who you are. Does it represent the communities that you serve? Does it represent the issues that you want to address? And if it doesn't, how can you take steps to move in that direction and in measurable ways?